Now, for more on President Xi's speech and other news from the forum, I'm joined now by Yun Sun, the co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with what stood out to you from President Xi's speech and the tone that it set for this meeting.
Well, I think coming to the FOCAC summit, the very one thing that people always pay attention to is the size of the financial commitment that China makes to the African continent. And this time, the level of commitment is equal, is the same as the one from 2015. So it's $60 billion US, which is very significant considering the demand and the need for financing from the African countries. And also, one thing that I noticed from the Xi Jinping's speech is the diversification of China's interest in Africa. So other than the financial commitment China has made, there's interest in, for example, infrastructure development, industrialization, there's interest in environmental protection, green development, dedicated interest to the healthcare and medical service in Africa, as well as Africa capacity building. So I would say that this document, this statement really represents a recalibration and a diversification of China's efforts and interests in Africa.
And there did seem to be a focus on really wanting to see tangible results from this money. Do we know anything about how these funds will be either prioritized or distributed?
Well, that's a very good question, because the composition of the fund is always a key here, that what percentage of the fund is for investment, what level is for concessional loans, for example. So we know that for this fund that 15 billion is dedicated for free grants, interest-free loans, as well as concessional loans. There's $20 billion US for credit line. So combined, the 35 billion is smaller compared to the 2015 commitment of $40 billion US for the grants, interest-free loans, concessional loans, and the credit. But for this grant, for this financial pledge, we also noticed that there is a dedicated $5 billion US for the African imports to China. So that's another way to help Africa to develop its export industry. So I would say that combined, we are seeing that China is developing new ways, new channels to help Africa to develop its economy.
And we also saw that Chinese companies were encouraged to invest more in African businesses, at least $10 billion over the next 3 years. Which sectors do you think are likely to see the bulk of that investment? Where is the main interest?
Well, traditionally, China's main interest in Africa is in the natural resources. And in recent years, we're seeing that China trying to diversify that interest, trying to reduce the level of the percentage of Africa's natural resources export to China, for example. But on the other hand, if we look at the investment numbers, China's investment to Africa has actually not been that impressive compared to China's investment to other regions. And there are plenty of reasons for that. But looking ahead for the next 3 years, this $10 billion US, since they are going to be implemented by Chinese companies, we would be able to see that the Chinese companies would be more interested in, for example, manufacturing businesses, more interested in the infrastructure businesses in Africa. So we hope that this level of commitment, not just through financing, not just through loans that African countries will have to pay back,
right. This
type of investment, a $10 billion US of investment, will truly show China's dedication to plant its roots in Africa and also to incorporate Africa's growth with China's own development.
And to that point, obviously, we've heard critics talk about this concept of a debt trap, but you've heard a lot of African business leaders and African leaders saying, no, this is not just a new form of colonialism. How do you see China's approach to investing and doing business with Africa compared to its previous relationship with Western counterparts?
Well, for investment or for the economic cycle to complete, there needs to be incentives for both sides, right? So I would say that for the Western style of aid and assistance, for example, is very much focused on the capacity building. And there's a logic to it. Without fixing the governance system, without fixing the political system, it is very difficult for the economic investment to transpire into great economic development. So from the Chinese perspective, China is adopting a different approach. They want to create the incentives for the locals to want to cooperate with China, and China will bring in the financing so that the financing under the joint cooperation of both sides will be able to produce economic growth. But that's a very different philosophy. But there are a lot of criticisms of the Chinese approach from the Western countries. And some of them are warranted. For example, the lack of attention that China pays, for example, to political conditions such as governance, accountability, transparency.
Right.
So all those are true. But then from the Chinese perspective, if you call this a debt trap, the other side of the same coin is a lender's trap, right? So China is the one who is throwing money into African continent. And by the end of the day, if the recipient governments cannot repay their loans, China will have a problem as well.
Right.
So I think there's incentive for both sides to prevent that from happening.
Certainly worth keeping in mind. Thank you so much. Yun Sun, Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center.